This presentation is in regards to Aldrich Ames, a KGB mole in the CIA. When reviewing our opportunities for cases to select, I chose Aldrich Ames because I had previously heard of him. I had some interest and previously was a criminal justice major years ago, so taking on this case was quite interesting for me. Aldrich Ames was born May 26, 1941, in River Falls, Wisconsin. He was born to a family of 3 children, being the oldest, and he was the only son. His father was a CIA Directorate of Operations in Virginia, but had failing performance reviews because of his serious alcoholism. When he was reassigned to McLean, Virginia, Aldrich attended McLean High School, and he worked as a records analyst during his high school years for the CIA, marking classified documents for filing. Ames entered the University of Chicago, but he ended up failing out due to his longtime passion for drama. When he returned to Washington, he worked the summer of 1960 as a laborer and painter at the CIA. He then began a stint at the Chicago Theater until February 1962, but that didn't work out, and he ended up returning to Washington and doing full-time employment with the CIA doing clerical work. In 1969, he did marry a fellow CIA officer, Nancy Siegerbarth, in which he met in a later training program. After working for the CIA for 5 years as a clerical worker, he ended up returning to George Washington University to obtain his bachelor's degree in history. He did not intend to have a career in the CIA, but at that point in time, he had achieved a high clearance level known as GS7, and he had received good performance appraisals, so he was accepted into a career trainee program. Despite having at this time several alcohol-related brushes with the police, he was still allowed to be in the program. This is where he met his fellow CIA officer and wife in 1969 and married her, Nancy Siegerbarth. During his career, Aldrich had several assignments, which we'll go over in the next few slides. The first one was in Ankara, Turkey from 1969 to 1972. At this point, Nancy does resign from the CIA because there was rules in place in which married couples could not be stationed at the same office. In Turkey, his position was to target Soviet intelligence officers for recruitment. He did have some success infiltrating a Devjunk, a communist organization, through a roommate of his. However, despite this, his performances were only rated as satisfactory. At the end of 1972, he was relocated to the CIA headquarters back in Virginia. He was assigned to the Soviet East European Division and did receive positive performance feedbacks, as he was better than with paperwork than actual agent recruiting. He did continue to have excessive drinking and issues that were notated in his file, but were never related to his performance feedbacks. They were never mentioned to him in particular. In 1976, Ames was relocated to New York City. There he handled 2 very important Soviet assets, and he received several promotions and bonuses. He was doing quite well. He had great feedback during his performance reviews, but they did note that he was having a tendency to procrastinate in submitting financial accounting, which was of great concern. Despite this, he was still ranked above most of the operations officers, but his inattention to detail was causing some security violations too, one of which was leaving a briefcase full of classified documents on the subway. For these incidents, he only received a verbal reprimand. In 1981, he was relocated to Mexico City, and his wife Nancy decided to stay behind in New York. While in Mexico City, Aldrich Ames engaged in 3 extramarital affairs. none of which were reported as per CIA rules to the CIA. And during this time period, he had excessive drinking continuing, and he did engage in a loud and drunken argument with a Cuban official during a diplomatic party in Mexico City that his superiors were quite concerned with. So we see Ames start to have his drinking affect his work in this time period from New York City to Mexico City from 1976 to 1983. His drinking is starting to affect his work. While in Mexico City, Ames did meet and have a long-standing affair with a woman, Maria del Rosario Casa Dupuy. She was a cultural attaché working in the Colombian embassy in Mexico City. Cultural attaché is someone who is promoting Colombian culture abroad. And during her time period at the Colombian embassy, she did become a CIA informant. She was a paid informant about a year into the assignment. As mentioned, Ames did not report his romance, although he was required to, especially when it's a foreign national that is involved in the affair. When Ames gets relocated back to Washington in 1983, she does follow him and pressure him to divorce Nancy, and they do. And he marries her on August 10th, 1985, shortly after the divorce is finalized. In October 1983, when Ames had gone down to Mexico City, they were separated, and in November of 1983, he did submit Rosario to the CIA as his romantic relationship. The divorce settlement that he and Nancy engaged in, Ames was required and agreed to pay the couple's debts and monthly alimony for 3.5 years, which totaled over $46,000. Ames was convinced and concerned that the divorce was going to bankrupt him, and what was more concerning is that Rosario was proving to be a very heavy spender. Her phone calls alone to her family back in Colombia were resulting in phone bills of over $400 a month, and she had excessive spending habits. After her arrest, it was actually determined that she had over 60 purses and 500 pairs of shoes. She was quite a heavy spender, racking up their credit card bills as well. And it was later said that Ames felt that the financial pressure was what first led him to consider spying for the Soviet Union. Part of Aldrich Ames' career and throughout his career, part of his position was to actively go out and try to find members of the Soviet government or embassy to engage them to see if they could become an intelligence asset for the United States. So part of his position was to actively engage people within the Soviet embassy, and he made contacts with the knowledge of both the CIA and FBI within the Soviet embassy. At this point, after his divorce, he had married Rosario, who was proving to have expensive tastes. He also felt like his career was coming to an end. He was the head of the counterintelligence operations against the KGB, but his remarks and his performance reviews were not substantiating further promotion. So at this point, knowing that he was facing debt from his recent divorce and his increasing debt due to Rosario's spending habits, he approached an individual within the Soviet embassy to establish his credentials as a CIA insider and asked for $50,000. He gave them what he determined to be essentially valueless information, but the Soviets paid it. He did have to go to some extent to prove himself and even approach the Soviet embassy, where he knew the FBI was taking pictures of those entering the building. He didn't care. He took a risk, and he left a note for Sergei, which we'll talk about next, to prove how serious he was. Ames stated later that he did not intend to do more than satisfy his immediate indebtedness, but once done, he felt like he couldn't go back. The money was just too easy to come by. Sergei was a first secretary of the Soviet embassy in Washington. He was said to have hated Americans, hated American culture, and he is the individual whom Aldrich reached out to establish himself as a spy for Russia. Um, he met with Sergei under the guise that he was trying to recruit him for the United States. During their time together, every time they had lunch, Ames would receive anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000, and Sergei was acting as a go-between between Ames and the KGB. The KGB had reviewed Sergei and determined that he was trustworthy enough to handle this information and could handle the money, and this became their long-term relationship over the course of 9 years. Early on in his engagement with the Soviet Union, the CIA's network of Soviet assets began disappearing at an alarming rate, but the CIA was reluctant to consider an agency mole. They began first looking for Soviet bugs or broken codes in transmittals, and then when Ames expressed concern to his KGB handler in regards to potentially being framed as a mole, he was able to then deflect multiple times, with the first one being to Edward Lee Howard, another CIA agent turned spy. But after some investigation, it was determined that Howard actually knew nothing about three sources that were eliminated. Um, the CIA actually during this time period approached Ames and apologized and stating that they had to actually eliminate all American assets because they were concerned about the alarming rate in which they were being eliminated. In the end, it's determined that Ames identified more than 10 top level CIA and FBI sources reporting on Soviet activity, and by reporting these sources, he also effectively eliminated the chances of him being discovered. It said that up to 25 people were named, and 10 of those were eliminated through um, being killed by the Soviet Union. Overall, he also impacted 100 operations and endangered the lives of dozens of agents. After the first arrangement, in which he received the $50,000 in a paper bag filled with nonsense, receipts, and things like that, at the bottom was the money. He told his wife Rosario that the money had been loaned to him interest free from a friend to pay off his debts, and he was able to hide the ongoing espionage from his wife for 7.5 of the 9 years, when the money became almost too much to cover up. When his divorce was final, he told everyone when he married Rosario that Rosario had come from a wealthy family in Colombia. He even went to such an extent to wire them money to help them in their impoverished state to cover up the story, to explain that they had some money. When Ames expressed concern to the KGB of being uncovered, they threw off investigators by creating diversions, one of which was a diversion of a mole at the Warrenton Training Center in Virginia, which was like a secretive training center that no one was supposed to know about. And the investigators spent over a year focusing there and did not come to any kind of conclusion. One of the investigators said there were so many characters they couldn't even determine that any one of them would have been involved in something like this. So he begins working with the KGB and his wife to cover up the incoming money. And once Rosario becomes aware of it, she goes along with it. She constantly talks to Ames about being careful with the money and finding ways to cover it up in such a way that he would not be so careless to potentially get caught. In 1985, when 10 of the assets that Ames had given up were eliminated, the CIA knew something was wrong, as mentioned earlier. So in 1986, upon realizing that it probably wasn't bugs or code being broken down through transmittals, they decided to compile a special team to investigate whether mole actually was likely. Um, Again, their three likely reasons were the KGB had infiltrated the agency's communications, or the KGB in Moscow obtained access to CIA documents, or they had placed a bug, or there was just simply a mole. Um, During the course of the investigation, they were led astray many times by KGB sources coming forward and deflecting away from Ames, because Ames was a valuable spy for the Soviet Union. So they kept constructing elaborate diversions. And in 1989, a friend of Ames actually reported to the investigators that she felt as though Rosario and Ames were living well beyond their means, but the investigators didn't focus there as they assumed and believed the story that had been told that Rosario came from wealth. During the 9 years that Ames spent spying for the Soviet Union, it's almost laughable how much money he made and how much this went unnoticed by the CIA. For example, he purchased his home in Arlington, Virginia for over $540,000 in cash. He spent $99,000 on renovations for the home. He drove around a brand new Jaguar that he paid for in cash of over $50,000. Um, During a Rome posting, and even when he was in the United States, Rosario and himself ran out phone bills over $5,000 at times. Most of these were calls back to her family in Colombia. Credit card purchases were being made as high as $30,000 a month, and there was deposits that sometimes were in excess of being over the $10,000 mark, in which they needed to be reported to the currency transaction reports for the IRS. He had two bank accounts with Credit Suisse in Zurich, and he had amassed over $950,000 through monthly deposits of $25,000. Overall, during his time period, Ames received $2.1 million, and another 2.6 was being slated for him and promised by the Soviets to come to him as he continued to go on and provide them with information. By 1990, the CIA was pretty certain there was a mole in the agency, but just didn't know where to focus. They kept getting diverted. Um, and a fellow employee, as we learned earlier, and a friend had approached the investigators and had expressed concern over the lavish lifestyle that Rosario and Ames were living. But during this time period in 1986 and 1991, Ames had passed two polygraph examinations. This was during the time that he was spying for the Soviet Union, and he was concerned about taking the polygraph test, but felt much calmer after the Soviets told him to be friendly with the examiners, so that they could not induce proper physiological responses. During this time, around 1992, there was finally a break in the case, about a year after the last polygraph test. They decided to focus on Ames because several coworkers started to approach them and express concern for changes in his physical appearance, especially regarding his teeth. They were previously yellowed from heavy smoking, and suddenly they were capped and quite bright. And his attire, which he previously couldn't afford a lot, he suddenly was able to have tailor-made suits that even superiors couldn't afford. So a financial expert focused on Ames and pulled all of Ames's financial records. He then worked alongside Sandra Grimes, one of the CIA investigators, to determine chronological events, to determine where was Ames as money started to coming into his bank account. Was it shortly thereafter a meeting with somebody from the Soviet embassy, and they began to piece together an actual timeline of events that made sense for this to be related to espionage and potentially be the mole. Sandra Grimes did report it to her superior, and in 1993 they finally turned the case over to the FBI to gather evidence to prepare for an arrest. In the United States, the FBI is responsible for arresting and creating the case for a stateside spy. The CIA was criticized for not bringing the FBI into it until so late in the game. And Ames was officially charged on February 22nd, 1994, almost 9 years after the initial treason happened. They finally chose to arrest him when they were concerned because there was known property that he had in Moscow, and he had a flight booked to head to Moscow, and they were concerned that they would never see him again, so they decided to finally move forward. The FBI, when they got the case, knew that they had to do a couple things, mainly, further prove the underlying activity to show that the money was actually coming from Russia. And they had to do this through several investigative techniques, starting with physical surveillance of Ames and Rosario, watching where they went when they, got drops for money. Who did they meet with? Were they meeting with Sergei and then shortly thereafter depositing money into the bank account? They were able to get a wiretap on their home telephones, recording multiple conversations with Ames and Rosario. During listening of this audio, Rosario was found to have known about the espionage. They got search warrants, of course. They did trash recovery. They interviewed his colleagues, his friends, his family, his co-workers. And finally, the interrogation of Ames and Rosario after the arrest. They seized his financial records after the arrest, and it proved what the agents already knew, that there was money that was not accounted for in his current income. He made only $70,000 a year, in salary, and they were living well beyond those means, so the money had to be coming from somewhere. As mentioned, Ames made about $69,000 to $70,000 a year as a CIA worker. His wife didn't work, and they had no other income. If we talk about simple accounting, assets being money or anything that can be turned into money, a liability is, something that you owe, that you like a credit card or a mortgage. Net worth is what you have after you subtract the liabilities from the assets, and that's also known as equity or capital. Income is money received, such as a salary, and expense is a cost of living. So if you take simple things such as an income statement or balance sheet, you can clearly see that Ames was spending way more than his reportable income. On a balance sheet, a normal year for Aldrich Ames and his wife would look such as an income of $69,000, expenses netting over $110,000, with a net income being a loss of $41,000. Their assets, they had a home with no mortgage. They paid outright for it with cash. Their Jaguar and Honda didn't have any monthly payments on it. They had paid for those with cash. There was 3 properties in Colombia, the furnishings, and several bank accounts. They did have outstanding debt on credit cards, which is the liabilities, but they were paying for that with cash every month. So in the time period that Aldrich Ames was committing espionage, his assets amassed over $2.3 million. His liabilities were $50,000. His net worth was $2.2 million. You know, again, the financial analysts can't back up or determine where he was able to get the money. You know, the income that was only reportable was his salary. He didn't have any relatives living abroad. You know, he was getting it all in cash. The relatives that were abroad were his in-laws, and you know, on further investigation, you know, it was determined that they really didn't have money that they were claiming that he did have. Either way, you know, Ames wasn't able to report any of the income from the espionage as income because clearly that would then out himself. So he was living well beyond his means because he had the cash to do so. He had numerous bank accounts, which he deposited numerous various transactions into. And he often did that in the days surrounding his meetings with the Soviet Union. I found this diagram in John Medinger's Money Laundering, a Guide for Criminal Investigations. Thought it was a great diagram to kind of outline all the expenses and all the assets and liabilities that Aldrich had. So, of course, there's the treason, the laundering money from the KGB. The KGB in the USSR gave cash of $2.7 million to Aldrich. And then he had three bank accounts. One he was a trustee of, where his mother-in-law had an account through Credit Suisse. And then he did have money that was being paid from that account to fund his lifestyle expenditures. He also had the two accounts, one for himself, one with Credit Suisse and one with First Union Bank. He would use the Credit Suisse account to wire transfer money to the Virginia account to then fund his lifestyle expenditures. He also did use the cash to do so. They had a maid, they had the telephone bills, the travel, the credit card, the home, the Jaguar, the Honda, the renovations. You know, when interviewed later on, Ames was later quoted as stating that he had considered opening a dummy corporation in his mother-in-law's name, because it would have been better to disguise and create layers and integration in the story to cover up the scheme. If he had been more smart about it, he probably could have gone on for years undetected because of, you know, his ability to cover it up. But he didn't. He wasn't too smart. He didn't cover it up. You know, he was directly taking the cash and depositing it into bank accounts with his name. You know, if you see $950,000 went to Credit Suisse and $1.5 million went to Virginia, the bank account in Virginia, and none of that could have been accounted for through legal means. By 1993, the CIA and FBI were focusing their entire investigation on Aldrich Ames. They knew he was the source of the mole. They just needed to further prove that through an investigation to obtain evidence. They did so through electronic surveillance. They combed through his trash, monitored his ongoings, his whereabouts, and he was pretty much under virtual constant surveillance. When in early 1994 he was set to travel abroad to Russia for a conference, the FBI and CIA felt that they could not wait any longer because they were concerned that they would never see him again. They knew that he had a property in Moscow that was gifted to him by the KGB as an opportunity or a potential place to go to if and when he became under scrutiny. So on February 22nd, 1994, his wife and Ames were formally charged with the DOJ. They had been arrested on February 21st. They were charged with spying for the Soviet Union and Russia, with Ames' betrayal resulting in 10 deaths of CIA assets. Ames pled guilty on April 28th and was sentenced to life in prison for espionage, conspiracy, and tax evasion. He's still serving his sentence out in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. Rosario took a plea bargain for 5 years for tax evasion and conspiracy to commit espionage. She served 63 months and, upon release, was deported to South America. When interviewed by investigators, Ames had said he was not afraid to be caught by the FBI and CIA. He was more concerned and afraid of Soviet defectors because he felt and knew that every American who had ever been jailed was fingered and pointed out by a Soviet defector, a Soviet source. So he himself kind of knew that he was getting away quite easily for 9 years with espionage, and he wasn't concerned about the FBI or the CIA's ability to find him. He was more concerned about being labeled a mole by a known Soviet defector. When you look at what Ames was able to do in 9 years and his extravagant way of living, his obvious increase in income and cash, the fact that the investigation wasn't pointed on him sooner than 9 years was the cause of a huge uproar in Congress. And I think the CIA failed because they were just unable to recognize failure within their own ranks. Even though Ames had continuously had poor performances and wasn't meeting to the standards of which they wanted him to, he was rarely able to recruit spies, but they never saw an issue with that lack of ability to produce. He was known for being arrogant and he thought he was smarter than all of them, but he wasn't able to perform. And his drinking often led to embarrassing incidents. It affected his ability to perform in many of his positions. In the long run, he was better at paperwork than he was at recruiting and his ability to influence others. In the beginning, the CIA put in an inexperienced accountant on the investigative team and refused to listen to the tips regarding Ames's finances. A friend of Ames's approached an investigator and expressed concern, and it was just brushed off because of the rumor that his wife had come from a wealthy family. And the agency was also recovering from a witch hunt that years earlier had destroyed the careers of promising case officers. So I think they were a little bit hesitant to acknowledge that there was a potential mole within their own ranks that could impact and have such knowledge shared amongst so many levels of intelligence. And they did ask an agent to look into Rosario's family, and that person only asked one person who had knowledge but did not have intimate knowledge of Rosario's family. Rosario grew up in a wealthy neighborhood, but it was all about appearances. Her family wasn't actually wealthy; they just had perceived wealth. So the agent just asked one person who happened to be a priest who knew of the family but without intimate knowledge, and that person, the priest, said, "Yeah, they have money." And then he passed polygraph tests. So all of that kind of led the CIA askew. Yes, they were being misled often by, diversions from the Soviet Union, from the KGB, through, fingering Edward Lee Howard or pointing the finger at the training center and saying that there was someone there that was giving up this information. But I think if they had just spent time looking at the actual facts in front of them before jumping to conclusions, then potentially this could have been handled and taken care of a lot sooner. Congress was very upset, and the CIA director, James Woolsey, at the time decided that no one would be dismissed or demoted or fired. Um, but he didn't feel that it was necessary, but perhaps it should have been. In the long run, he ended up resigning over the pressure. And 9 years into it, they had lost so many valuable assets. When thinking about Aldrich Ames, and thinking about what I might have asked him as an investigator, I kind of go back to, the silly question: why? What's such an increase to income? Why didn't he take steps to cover that? He talked about he had thought about creating a corporation in his mother-in-law's name to help cover the story, but he didn't. And whether that was just simple laziness or arrogance, we don't know. But I'd be curious to know, why didn't he push that further? What prevented him from doing so? Another question I'd be interested in asking is, was there any point in time that the contact between him and his, Sergei and any other Soviet assets, did it ever change or increase based on, political ongoings? Was there ever a point in time where they maybe met, more frequently than normal? Because I would have thought that something would have been something that an investigator might trigger in on and say, Aldrich is spending so much time with the Soviet embassy individual to try to recruit him. Why is he failing? What is happening here? I know we go back to his performance reviews being insubstantial and his inability to recruit someone, but to spend so much time with one individual and still fail, and how much did they meet? That's concerning. Another question would be, were you ever asked to obtain specific information for the Soviets, or were they just simply relying on whatever was provided by him? Did they ever specifically ask for information on, the political atmosphere, president, the director of the CIA? I know they were constantly concerned about, the informants within their own agency that Aldrich gave up. But what other information had he given to them? What other information were they interested in obtaining? It might, lead us to know where potentially we could focus our investigation in the future for other individuals who might be susceptible to being coerced. And Aldrich did actually give up a very good friend of his to the KGB as a asset. And I just, from a friendship perspective, did he ever regret that? Did he ever feel remorse? They touch on it briefly in a lot of the articles that I read, but they never really delved into it. And I don't know that he's ever been asked. His espionage led to a lot of deaths, but the fact that he was so willing to give up his own friend, that says a lot, and that says a lot about his character. So I'd just be interested in talking about that with him. And what would be the most valuable information he thought that he had given up? We know he gave up several assets that did result in deaths and affected hundreds of investigations and operations, but what did he feel was the most valuable information? And then in turn, what information led to the biggest payout? What information did they find the most interesting and the most valuable? Because again, that could lead to future investigations and into, what were they interested in learning about? What were they interested in focusing on? Because if he received a big payout for something that he didn't deem valuable, what is in that information that they're so interested in? And then what's his greatest fear during the time period in which he was providing information? We hear him talk about being concerned for being fingered by a Soviet source, but what was he concerned about? Was he concerned about going to jail because of a Soviet defector? Or was he concerned about, the embarrassment? Was he concerned about potentially losing his own life? What was it that led to that fear, and what other fears did he have during this time period? When you think of what all Ames got away with in 9 years, you kind of wonder what deceptive cues might have been out there for investigators to kind of hone in on and recognize. Some of the verbal cues that I think he might have exhibited were, well, one, his refusal to implicate other suspects. When he was arrested, he didn't want to acknowledge Rosario's involvement. He told investigators that she was coerced, that she didn't know for 7.5 years, and that he was even able to blackmail her into staying quiet. He had known of other spies who had been implicated by their own wives, so he didn't want Rosario to be part of that. But when you go back to his polygraph that he was able to pass, he was able to feign unconcern. You know, he came into the room and was relaxed and overly friendly, and you know, the polygraph examiners weren't able to gauge the physiological responses that they should have been able to. You know, that feigned unconcern in interviews, you know, was because he wasn't concerned by the actions and the consequences of what he was doing. He had a tolerant attitude. He was able to, you know, separate. He talks about in an interview, because of being a CIA agent, and being like kind of living a double life and being a diplomat in other, you know, countries, he was able to subset his CIA job and his diplomatic job and compartmentalize his feelings. And I think this is very transparent, or probably was very transparent in his ongoings throughout his job. He was arrogant, from what I can obtain in reading in articles. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He didn't understand why he wasn't being promoted. He thought he was doing quite well. He didn't understand his perceived undervalued. So, you know, his ability to feign unconcern during interviews and especially during polygraph examinations should have been some kind of, you know, alert. You know, nonverbal cues, you know, they don't talk a lot about his nonverbal cues, but I imagine him thinking he's, you know, the smartest one in the room, that, you know, he might have had some full body motions. He might have been illustrative in his gestures and exaggerated. And I imagine him thinking he's the smartest person in the room, that he might be very interested and reactive in knowing the evidence that led to his arrest. You know, he was characterized as bumbling and fumbling and not quite smart, but he thought he was smart. He was manipulative. He was able to get away with this for 9 years, you know, arrogantly, without concern for hiding the money and the income that was coming in. It was quite shocking. So I imagine if I had met him in person, that he might be someone who exhibits grand gestures with, you know, hands and body language. In conclusion, I think there's a lot to be learned from Aldrich Ames's case. You know, when he pled guilty on April 28th, 1994, there was concern that without a courtroom trial, that they wouldn't know the full scope of what had transpired over these past 9 years. So a committee was put together, committee on the Intelligence United States Senate, to look into his case and determine what had happened. And they interviewed his colleagues, his co-workers, his wife, himself, and they tried to determine what led him to do this, what was given over, and what could be done in future to prevent it. And I think when we go to, you know, why did this happen, I think we can see the fraud triangle happening. You know, there was the perceived pressure from his financial difficulties, his ongoing debt from his divorce, Rosario's increasing spending habits that were leading him to feel this perceived pressure to find a solution. And then the perceived opportunity. You know, he had access to all this valuable information at the CIA. He was stationed at a high rank in, you know, this, the division, and he knew of a colleague who had been offered money for information just through normal investigative work, and he knew that the amount was something that could cover his current financial difficulties. As you hear him say, he rationalized the first giving of what he deemed valueless information to the KGB to just establish himself as a CIA informant. He rationalized it by saying, "Well, I only gave them information that wasn't going to produce anything of value." So that perceived pressure and that perceived opportunity was then rationalized away into a reasoning for it, and it's quite simple. When you look at what he was able to then do. I think at that point it was so easy that he just decided to keep going. That the boundary had been crossed. Rosario's continued spending habits were going to keep on going, and I think he just looked at it as, well, I guess I need to just continue. So, from there, we learn about, we see that it's just simple accounting. His income clearly did not meet the amount of assets and the amount of expenses that he was accruing year after year. And if the CIA had just spent some time looking at that a little bit more in depth and kind of doing some background and legwork on Rosario too, they might have concluded sooner that what was going on wasn't fruitful. Rosario, the story of her coming for money should have been explored sooner. He was obligated to disclose this relationship to the CIA, and he did so, but only after they'd already begun. And there was no background check on her. There was no follow-up to see what her lifestyle was and who she was. It was just, okay, you have a new wife, let's move on. And if that had been investigated a little further, perhaps they would have, come to the conclusion much sooner rather than later that there was this ongoing financial, mismatch between what he was making and what he was doing financially, his expenses. So there's a lot to learn from him. The CIA clearly, kind of fell down here. They didn't want to admit that there was a mole within their ranks. They didn't want to acknowledge that someone that was born into a CIA family that had such a high-ranking career, even though it wasn't the most successful career, could and would do something like this. It's astonishing, and I don't know that Ames even knows that why. He talks about motivation and talks about the stress of money and the stress of his financial pressure, but looking back as to why he continued, he was able just to compartmentalize and not really think about the actions that were going to cause the deaths of people. So he just, continued moving on and increased his espionage activities with them. So there's a lot to learn here. I think in the long run the CIA could have definitely handled this a lot better. They recognized a problem early on in 1985, but it took them so long. There should have been more staff accommodated to the investigation that could have maybe triggered this. Maybe a more valuable or knowledgeable accountant to review all the books of all the employees that had access to all this information. Something like that. Perhaps a yearly review of all that could have potentially resulted in his capture much sooner. So thank you for listening. This is Erin, and this is the case of Aldrich Ames.